asking and answering questions about the solid Earth has not always been called geology, and these questions do not only belong to geologists. But to understand some of the most basic assumptions that we in the geological sciences make, it helps to see where we started and how we have grown. Before geology was a science, it was part of natural philosophy. And before the 18th century, most scholars in Europe were also theologians, so it's understandable that most evidence from the solid Earth supported biblical accounts of history. Now, when geology was forming as a science, there were two main camps. Those who believed that science would always support religion, and if it did not, it must be changed or reinterpreted, and those who felt that science was a separate thing from religion, and that if it found evidence to the contrary to biblical understanding, then the science was to be believed. It's in this framework that a great debate erupted over the formation of granite and basalt, the age of rocks, and ultimately the age of the Earth itself. Some sought to bridge the gaps between religion and science, but ultimately this debate began a chasm between the two that has, in my opinion, strengthened both by helping to define their roles in the human experience. And before we go on, I want to make it clear that even though there are many aspects of this debate that were religious in nature, and that the secular views, quote, won the debate, the theologians were on the losing side not because they were religious, but because their interpretation of the rocks was flawed. And many of the geologists on the winning side were also deeply religious. So really, it wasn't a fight over religion, it was a fight over a very specific question. And we will explore that question after we hear from three leading hypotheses of the time. Late in the 17th century, a hypothesis from a German professor of mining and mineralogy proposed that all rocks formed from the crystallization of minerals that were floating around in the Earth's oceans. Now, this idea was widely accepted at the time because we knew that sedimentary rocks like limestones do form this way, and that rocks under the surface of the Earth are layered as if they settled out of a solution. Now, many natural theologians also accepted this idea because it fit in with the idea of a catastrophic flood, like Noah's flood from the Bible. Incidentally, they called it Neptunism after the Greek god of the oceans. Now, one of the important ideas in Neptunism is that our current oceans do not have all the minerals in them that they used to, so new rocks like basalt and granite cannot form today. This would mean that the conditions of the Earth in the past were significantly different than they are today. This would mean that Earth processes are not uniform through time. Now, in direct opposition to that hypothesis was Plutonism, named after the Greek god of the underworld. This idea is that we observe volcanoes today making rocks, so it stands to reason that volcanoes in the past would have made rocks too. It also makes more sense that Earth processes that we see today also happened in the past, and it makes less sense to say that the Earth was different when rocks were formed, so that we can't observe those processes. Now, another quick note is that a lot of these natural philosophers that were catastrophists or Neptunists did not ever directly observe volcanoes, okay? And that's because they were from places in Europe that don't have a lot of volcanoes, all right? And so that is one of the reasons why they were not observing these rocks being formed. Now, another hypothesis of the time was called Catastrophism, which I just mentioned. This idea, simply put, is that the Earth has been, by and large, formed by violent and sudden and short episodes. Theologians who were also geologists said that mountains, oceans, craters, all of these were formed in the 7 days of creation. And because God no longer is creating the Earth, new mountains, oceans, and all of these are not being formed. In fact, no new mountains will ever formed. Now, theologians were not the only proponents of catastrophism. There were some who never ever mentioned religion or metaphysics, but still held that each of the epochs that we can see in the fossil record were ended by some sudden revolution of Earth's conditions, which made the Earth largely different than it was before. Whatever the flavor of catastrophist you were, you basically believed that the conditions on Earth remained static until some great upheaval and then returned to some static form. This argument really boils down to this question. Does the Earth change so drastically that today's scientific laws can no longer apply to a time before written history? The Neptunist camp said yes, because why do we assume that science applies to everything over all time? Right? The Plutonist camp said no, we have no physical evidence to support a drastically different Earth in the past. Now, it's in the heat of this argument that the hypothesis of Unitarian or uniformitarianism was born, and this would change the underlying assumptions of geological science forever. So what is uniformitarianism, and how did it seek to answer the question? Well, watch the next video in this series to find out.